Before we begin this video, I would like to announce that on March 29th, this channel will be officially 1 year old. When I started this channel, obviously I had 0 subscribers, and I'm very pleased to see that in the span of a year, we've gone to such a large extent. By March 29th, I've set this as a goal for myself. I'd like to reach 5,000 subscribers, so if you could help in that, I'd be very, very much appreciative. Sharing the video. If you're a first-time watcher, subscribing, that'd be very, very nice. Thank you, please, okay? And enjoy the video. Also forgot to mention, if we reach 5,000 by March 29th, I will set up a little raffle thingy, select a random viewer, and that person will be able to decide what my next video, after I'm done completing whatever video I'm on at that moment, will be. So now you can join the video. Sudan is an African country located in what is referred to as the Sahel region. Before the Nile River empties out into the Mediterranean Sea through Egypt, it widens down through Sudan, and where the blue and white Niles intersect lies the capital city of Khartoum. Khartoum has been the seat of Omar Al-Bashir, who had ruled Sudan under a dictatorship for 30 years since June 30th, 1989. On April 11th, 2019, Omar al-Bashir was ousted by the military after months of protests. If you, like me, were aware of these protests, which began in 2018, you might have noticed people substituting their profile pictures on social media with blue circles. These were meant to signify solidarity with the pro-democracy protests in Sudan. And yet, 2 years later, Sudan is still nowhere near being a democracy. Blood has been shed in order to release the military's grip on their nation, yet so far the Sudanese have had to continue to struggle. Sudan is most known for its devastating civil war, with what used to be its southern region and is now called South Sudan. But time moves forward, and new struggles emerge as people try to build for themselves a better future. This video is about that struggle, why it happened, its history, and what has been going on since the people of Sudan began that struggle. Before there was a republic, Sudan was controlled by the condominium of the British and Egyptians until 1956, January 1st. The new Muslim-led Sudanese government had no constitution, was corrupt, had tense relations with Egypt, and was now dealing with a civil war with the predominantly Christian South. In 1958, after winning an election, the then head of state, Abdullah Khalil, did a coup against his own government and gave control to the military. For 6 years, they were in charge until civilian control was re-established in 1964. The military government had failed to quell the southern uprising and failed to improve education and the economy, so people protested. These protests were suppressed until the people launched a general strike and began rioting, thus returning the government to civilian rule in what is called the October Revolution of 1964. This lasted for about 5 years, until 1969, where there was yet another military coup. The coup plotters pointed to the weak governance, the lack of a constitution, the bad economy, and failure at ending the civil war. This dictatorship lasted 16 years, from 1969 to 1985. This dictatorship under Jafar Numayri ended the civil war in 1972, and then reignited it in 1983 by attempting to introduce Sharia law across the nation. Faced with bitter opposition from secularized Muslims and the southern Christians, and a general strike over a rise in prices for essential goods, the military decided to lead another coup on April 6, 1985, and then an election the next year in 1986. This election was at the time one of the freest and fairest elections in Africa. For the second time in Sudan's history, civilian rule was re-established under the leadership of Sadiq al-Mahdi. He was tasked with ending the civil war, replacing the Sharia penal code, reaching a more favorable agreement with the IMF, and forming a governing coalition. He failed at all of this. If you've been paying attention, you know what happens next. One of the reasons that he failed was due to his inability to get the National Islamic Front, led by Hassan al-Turabi, to remain in a coalition dedicated to repealing Sharia. Sadiq wanted to convene a constitutional convention with the Christian South without a dedication to upholding Sharia. The NIF, the National Islamic Front, refused to be a part of this coalition. Hassan al-Turabi and Colonel Omar al-Bashir launched a military coup on June 30th, 1989. Unlike al-Turabi, al-Bashir was not a politician, and though he was the leader of the coup, his co-conspirator al-Turabi was very influential and popular. Al-Bashir jailed him. Thus, al-Bashir set about a process of consolidating what would eventually become his 30-year rule over Sudan. He purged the armed forces of suspected coup plotters and arrested subversives with no trial, all of whom were undoubtedly tortured. Starting in 1990, al-Bashir began a policy of a bastardized Islamization of society, where leaving the faith was now punishable by death, and women could not sell food or tea after 5 p.m. Non-Muslims were denied access to senior positions in government. Since 1991 and during Omar al-Bashir's reign, Osama bin Laden had been residing in Sudan. This, among a bunch of U.S. intelligence reports, prompted the United States to label Sudan a state sponsor of terror and thus sanction them. After al-Qaeda bombed some U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the U.S. bombed a Sudanese pharmaceutical factory, despite no evidence linking Sudan to the attack. The factory was said to produce chemicals used for weapons of mass destruction, but there was no evidence for this either. During this time, al-Turabi, after being released in 1991, was continuing to marginalize al-Bashir, creating connections globally and internationally. When a plane crash killed al-Bashir's vice president and a huge chunk of his cabinet, al-Turabi made his move and moved his guys into those empty positions. Al-Turabi, however, doomed himself when he attempted to arrange an assembly vote which would allow the assembly to be able to remove the head of state. Al-Bashir swiftly dissolved the assembly and implemented a state of emergency. Later, he would arrest, then release, then arrest, then release Turabi again and again and again, thus making him not a political threat anymore and furthermore consolidating his power. Despite his political repression, Omar al-Bashir was also able to end the civil war in 2005 and allowed South Sudan independence in 2011. However, around the same time he was negotiating the end of the civil war, a new civil war began in the Darfur region in 2003. According to the UN, from 2003 to 2011, 300,000 people died. According to the ICC, he committed several crimes against humanity, including murder, forced transfer, and genocide. They placed warrants for his arrest in 2009. This criminally short history of the 3 dictators, 2 revolutions, and 2 civil wars of Sudan all culminate into the subject of this video, Sudan's 3rd and current revolution. This is an ongoing revolution, and almost every bit of history I have mentioned so far is extremely relevant to how the current events have panned out and will pan out. Since the end of the civil war in 2011, people have protested against al-Bashir. For example, in 2013, they protested a rise in fuel costs. Al-Bashir's forces killed over 200 people in response. However, the protests which began in 2018 produced more dramatic results. The protest movement against al-Bashir began in the city of Atbara, located north of Khartoum. After losing the oil-rich south in 2011, the economy of Sudan had begun to suffer, thus causing the government to adopt austerity measures. When the government suddenly tripled the price of bread, in December of 2018, the people of Atbara took action. Students took to the streets and protested. The government cracked down, and in response, on December 19th, they burnt down al-Bashir's local party office. Protests spread around the entire country, partly due to women like Alaa Salah, whose image went viral as she led anti-regime chants in an iconic photo that promulgated the revolution. Protests lasted for months and were very successful due to the organization of its leaders. The Sudanese Professionals Association would post last-minute instructions for protests, thus catching the army by surprise, and working in tandem with local resistance committees who kept protests ongoing. However, nothing exemplified the genius involved in these protests quite like the April 6th sit-ins. Now, if you guys have been paying attention, April 6th is the anniversary of the end of the military dictatorship of the 1985 revolution. To celebrate, they decided to move towards the military's headquarters. Now, normally this would have failed and the military would have blocked them, but the protesters tricked the military. They announced the protest at a different time and location, thus increasing military buildup and attention in an entirely different area of the city. Using sympathizers within the military, they maneuvered about the city, placing protesters in key areas ready to march onto the headquarters. By 3 p.m., the Sudanese Professional Association made their ultimatum. They would not move until Al-Bashir got lost. People poured into this area that was captured. Al-Bashir ordered for protesters to be dispersed, but some members of the military began to defect. Even the use of party-associated militias did not shake the protesters, who now had begun to build barricades. On April 11th, Al-Bashir was out of office, and after a brief power struggle was replaced by General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, with a man known as Hemeti acting as deputy. The protesters did not trust Hemeti, because he took part in the aforementioned genocide in Darfur in 2003, killing hundreds of thousands of people. People kept protesting. The protesters formed the FFC, or the Forces for Freedom and Change, and began negotiating with the government. Hemeti's forces demanded that protesters end their sit-in, but the protesters refused. On June 3rd, Hemeti's rapid support forces dispersed the crowd by massacring protesters, killing 120 people. They filmed themselves beating protesters with canes, demanding that they support the military. Though they dispersed the sit-in, they utterly failed to crush the spirit and resistance of the people of Sudan. FFC called for civil disobedience, a general strike, and lastly for a 1 million-man march in Khartoum. On June 30th, thousands had flooded the streets in Khartoum, and the military had finally been backed into a corner. By July 17th, they signed an agreement with protesters, creating a power-sharing deal that eventually led to the appointment of Abdullah Hamdok al-Kinani, a former UN official who would serve as the Prime Minister of Sudan. The agreement also stipulated that there would be a 3-year transition period until 2023, when at last there would be elections. The situation was still tense between the civilians and the military, and protests continued. Some questions remained, such as what to do about Omar al-Bashir and how to get Sudan off the US sponsor of terror list. Al-Bashir at this point was in jail and sentenced for corruption charges, receiving millions of dollars in the form of gifts from Saudi Arabia. But he was also wanted by the ICC for crimes against humanity. The solution was to let the ICC have al-Bashir. The details on this, including the time frame and where the trials will be held, are still being sorted out, but he will now answer to his crimes. Hamdok was also able to sign a peace agreement with rebels in Darfur as well. In order to strong-arm Sudan into normalizing ties with Israel, the US, under Trump, leveraged Sudan's placement on the sponsor of terrorism list, even after they had removed al-Bashir. This forced a fragile, transitional regime to make a decision that was incredibly unpopular with the public in order to form better economic relations. The US also forced Sudan to pay $335 million for the embassy attacks which took place under the aforementioned removed dictator al-Bashir. On March 9, 2020, an attempt was made on Hamdok's life, most likely committed by those with ties to the previous regime. Things would continue to deteriorate. The agreement between the protesters and the military stipulated that the civilians halfway through the transition towards 2023 would be given the ability to govern. As that day drew near, General Burhan decided that actually he was the only one who could transition his country to a democracy, and in late October 25th, 2021, placed Hamdok and other officials under house arrest. Burhan asked Hamdok to step down. However, Hamdok refused, and the nation once again got up to protest. By November 21st, Hamdok had been reinstated and signed a deal with the military to release political prisoners and have the government be run by technocrats under military supervision. The Sudanese Professional Association and the Forces for Freedom and Change were not having any of it and denounced what they saw as negotiations with the coup plotters demanding full civilian control. Hamdok came to see that he could no longer be prime minister and resigned on January 2nd. Between the latest coup and now, the military has killed 82 protesters. Now the military is tasked with the transition towards civilian rule. They promise that they will hold elections in 2023, but they have not garnered the trust of the people as they continue to protest to this day, completely unrelenting until they attain a civilian-led government and the military goes back to the barracks. This can be a bit less formal of a conclusion than I usually do. I started researching for this video a while ago, and I was very much interested in this subject because I feel like it's a subject not a lot of people cover, but it's very exciting. It's a very exciting thing. Like, people are resisting against the government, a very authoritarian country, and they're trying to make their lives better. And what they've done so far has been amazing, and what they will do, I think, will be continue to be amazing. I'm gushing over this the Sudanese and their ability to resist the authoritarianism in their country. If you like this video, please like, share, comment below, and subscribe. This video was brought to you by our patrons. If you would like to become a patron, link in the description. If you cannot become a patron, the best thing you can do to help this channel grow is to share the video. I'm going to list out the patrons now: Pyrotic Napalm, Adam Elbilia, Avocado Kirby, Tom Rollins, and Nomad Star. And with that, I want to thank you for watching the video. Have a good day.